It was a warm evening on September 12, 1962, when Dean Martin arrived at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas to perform his evening show. The air in the Copa room was thick with anticipation. Las Vegas, as usual, was alive with its signature energy. Neon lights reflecting off the Strip, people hustling in and out of casinos, and the never-ending hum of excitement in the air. Dean Martin, the king of cool, was one of the most beloved stars of the Rat Pack, and his performances always captivated audiences. The show was about to begin, and the 2,400-seat room was buzzing with energy. However, backstage, something was happening that would change the course of Dean's career and perhaps the entire Las Vegas entertainment scene. Dean was in his dressing room, adjusting his bow tie in front of the mirror, preparing for his usual performance. As he straightened his tuxedo, Jackie Romano, his assistant, entered the room, looking unsettled. She hesitated at the door before finally speaking. "Dean, there's a situation," she said, clearly uncomfortable. Dean, though distracted, looked up at her, trying to gauge the gravity of the situation. "What kind of situation?" he asked, his voice calm but inquisitive. Jackie took a deep breath and, after a moment's hesitation, replied, "Security is removing someone from backstage. An older guy. He was just sitting near the loading dock, not bothering anyone." Dean raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "So why are they removing him?" he asked, his voice taking on a sharper edge. Jackie hesitated before responding. "He's a Negro, Dean. Management says he doesn't have clearance to be back here." Her words hung heavy in the air. Dean, who had seen his fair share of inequality and unfair treatment in his life, especially during his childhood, understood immediately what was happening. He didn't need her to explain further. Dean, who had seen firsthand how people of color were treated in the segregated world of 1960s Las Vegas, walked toward the loading area without another word. He couldn't just ignore it. Not this time. As Dean walked down the hallway toward the loading dock, he saw the scene unfolding before him. Two security guards, standing side by side in their Sands uniforms, were escorting an older black man, maybe in his 70s, toward the exit. The man wasn't resisting in any way. In fact, he appeared resigned to whatever was happening. He walked quietly, as if he had endured this kind of treatment many times before, perhaps his whole life. Dean's eyes locked onto the older man's face as the security guards led him toward the door. He could see the quiet dignity in the man's expression, the way he accepted his fate without a word, without protest. It hit Dean like a punch to the gut. "What's going on?" Dean asked, his voice calm but heavy with an unspoken tension. One of the guards turned to face him. "Mr. Martin, it's nothing to worry about. We're just removing someone who shouldn't be here," the guard said dismissively. Dean turned his attention toward the older man standing quietly at the center of the scene. "Who is he?" Dean asked, his curiosity and empathy deepening. The guard shifted uncomfortably. "His name is Willie Hayes," the guard explained. "He used to play piano here when the Sands first opened back in '52. He just wanted to see the place again." Dean's mind raced. He knew exactly who Willie Hayes was. Willie had been a part of the Sands' early days, part of the foundation that helped build the entertainment scene in Las Vegas. And now this man, who had once been welcomed as a part of the Sands family, was being escorted out as if he didn't matter anymore. Dean could feel the injustice in the air, thick and suffocating. "And he doesn't have a ticket?" Dean asked, his voice becoming colder. "No, Mr. Martin." "House rules," the guard replied, sounding almost robotic. Dean knew what those rules meant. In 1962, the Sands, like every other hotel and casino in Vegas, ran on an unwritten code. Black performers could entertain on stage, but they couldn't eat in the same restaurants, stay in the same rooms, or gamble in the casinos. The rules were clear, even if they were never spoken aloud. Dean had grown up in a world where discrimination was a reality. As the son of Italian immigrants in Steubenville, Ohio, he had faced prejudice of his own. He remembered the hurtful slurs his father, Gaetano, had to endure. Gaetano had worked as a barber, struggling to be accepted in a town that saw him as different because of his accent and his background. Dean had seen firsthand how hard his father worked to earn respect, even when it wasn't given freely. The memories of watching his father suffer under the weight of bigotry resonated deeply with Dean. He knew what it was like to feel like an outsider. He understood Willie Hayes in a way that few others in Las Vegas did. Dean stood there for a long moment, staring at Willie, then at the guards and finally at the exit. He felt his chest tighten. He didn't know exactly what was happening, But he knew that he couldn't just walk away this time. He couldn't stay silent. Not this time. Dean entered the Copa room just like any other night, stepping onto the stage with his usual cool, confident demeanor. The audience erupted in applause as he began his set, and for the first few minutes, everything seemed like business as usual. The music played, the lights dazzled, and the audience was swept away by Dean's smooth performance. But Dean's mind was far from the show. In the back of his mind, he kept replaying what had just happened backstage. The image of Willie Hayes, the quiet resignation in his eyes, haunted him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to change. As Dean sang That's Amore, his voice started to lose its usual crispness. He felt distracted, his mind wandering back to the loading dock, to the way Willie was being escorted out like a criminal, just for being there. He looked toward the back of the room and saw something that made his blood run cold. The security guards were walking Willie Hayes through the Copa room, but they weren't taking him through the backstage corridor. No, they were walking him through the audience area, past the tables and the bar, as if to make a point. It was a display of power, a statement about who was allowed to be seen and who wasn't. Dean's voice faltered as he watched Willie, head down, shuffling toward the exit. The audience was still laughing, talking, enjoying the show, completely unaware of the scene unfolding in front of them. But Dean saw it. He couldn't ignore it. His voice dropped, and the song lost its rhythm. His eyes followed Willie as he was pushed toward the back of the room. The band continued to play, but Dean was no longer in sync with them. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the injustice that was happening right in front of him. Ken Lane, the pianist who had worked with Dean for years, noticed the change. He had seen Dean perform hundreds of times, but tonight was different. The usual spark in Dean's eyes was gone, replaced by something deeper, something troubling. Ken could see that something was weighing on Dean, and he knew it wasn't about the performance. It was about something bigger. Dean had always been a professional, always cool under pressure, but tonight, he wasn't just singing. He was living through something that was too big to ignore. A note was passed to Dean during a musical break. It was written on a cocktail napkin, and it read, "Finish the show. Don't make trouble." Dean glanced at the note, but it didn't make him feel better. He wasn't sure what to do. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The note was clear: finish the show, don't stir things up. But Dean wasn't sure he could do that anymore. He looked back at Willie, still being escorted toward the exit, and his heart sank. He had seen this happen so many times, to Sammy and to other performers, but this time it was different. He couldn't stay quiet. Without thinking, Dean stopped singing. Mid-word, the music continued, but Dean stood there, microphone in hand, staring out at the room. The audience, confused, fell silent. 2,400 people, all watching, wondering what was happening. For a moment, everything was still. The band played for a few more bars before the music died off into uncomfortable silence. The tension in the room was palpable. Dean stood frozen, staring toward the back of the room where the security guards had stopped moving. The atmosphere had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. Something was happening, but no one knew exactly what. Dean stood still, letting the silence build. The band members glanced nervously at each other. The audience, unsure of what was happening, was caught in the moment. Dean's eyes were still on Willie, but now he was focused on something even bigger. The truth that had always been there, hiding in plain sight. This wasn't just about one man being escorted out. It was about the system, the injustice, and the silence that allowed it to continue. Dean knew that he couldn't remain silent any longer. As the silence in the Copa room stretched on, Dean made a decision that would forever change how he saw himself and how the world saw him. He walked to the front of the stage, his movements deliberate, his pace steady. The audience watched in complete silence, 2,400 people holding their breath. Dean's voice broke the silence, cutting through the tension in the room. "Folks, we have a situation here," he said, his voice carrying across the room with perfect clarity. The murmurs in the audience started as people wondered if Dean was sick, or if something was wrong with the show. But Dean wasn't concerned with any of that. He was concerned with one thing: Willie Hayes, the man being escorted out of the room as if he didn't matter. Dean's voice softened as he spoke. "That gentleman being escorted out, his name is Willie Hayes," he said, pointing toward Willie, who was still standing by the exit. "He played piano here at this hotel when the Sands first opened in 1952. He's part of the reason this hotel and this city are what they are today." The casino manager, standing in the wings, stepped forward, looking pale and nervous. "Mr. Martin, we can discuss this after the show," he said, trying to defuse the situation. But Dean wasn't going to wait. "No," he said firmly, his voice resolute. "We're going to discuss it now." The room was still. The guards holding Willie's arms had stopped moving. Dean continued, his words carrying through the room. "I don't perform in places that treat people this way," he said, his gaze unwavering. He could feel the weight of the audience's attention on him, but he didn't flinch. He didn't back down. The casino manager, realizing the gravity of the situation, quickly nodded. "Mr. Hayes can stay," he said, his voice tight. "We apologize for the misunderstanding." Dean gave a small nod, his expression never changing. "Thank you," he said simply. Then, as if nothing had happened, he turned back toward the microphone, raised it to his lips, and smiled at the audience. "Now, where were we?" The applause began, tentative at first, then building, growing louder and more heartfelt. The audience wasn't clapping for the music. They were clapping for Dean Martin's courage. They were clapping for his refusal to stay silent, for his willingness to stand up for what was right, even when it was risky. After the show, Dean found Willie Hayes sitting alone on a crate near the loading dock. The security guards had gone, and Willie was left alone to reflect on what had just happened. Dean walked over and sat down beside him, lighting a cigarette. They sat in silence for a few moments, each processing the evening in their own way. "You okay?" Dean asked, breaking the quiet. Willie nodded slowly. "I appreciate what you did, Mr. Martin," he said. "But you didn't have to do that. I didn't want to cause any trouble." Dean shook his head, a quiet smile playing on his lips. "You didn't cause trouble, Willie," he said. "You were just asking for the same respect everyone else gets." They sat in silence for a while longer, each man contemplating the significance of what had just happened. Dean Martin had always been the epitome of cool. His charisma was legendary, his performances smooth and effortless, and his reputation as the undisputed star of Las Vegas was unmatched. But as he stood in his dressing room on the evening of September 12, 1962, preparing for yet another show at the Sands Hotel, something was weighing on him, something he couldn't ignore. It had started with a simple, almost innocuous request from his assistant, Jackie Romano, who had come to him with news of an incident backstage. A quiet, older black man had been escorted out by security. He wasn't causing any trouble, wasn't bothering anyone. He simply wanted to be in the space he had once belonged to, a piano player who had helped build the Sands into the iconic hotel it was. But Dean knew exactly what was happening, and he knew too, that it wasn't just another moment to ignore. It was the kind of moment that defined who you were, who you chose to be in the face of the status quo. Dean was no stranger to prejudice. He'd grown up in a small town in Ohio, the son of Italian immigrants who had faced their own share of discrimination. His father, Gaetano, had worked as a barber in a town where his accent and heritage made him an outsider. Dean had seen how hard his father worked to be accepted, how he constantly fought to overcome the stigma of being different. As a child, Dean had been called names and faced rejection for being Italian, and it left a mark on him. He understood what it felt like to be pushed aside, to be denied the respect that everyone deserved. As Dean walked toward the loading dock that night, he couldn't help but recall his father's quiet rage. He played piano here at this hotel when the Sands first opened in 1952. Before any of you knew about Las Vegas, before the Rat Pack, before any of us made a name for ourselves, Willie was here, helping to make this hotel what it is. The casino manager appeared in the wings, his face pale with fear. "Mr. Martin, we can discuss this after the show," he said, trying to dismiss the situation, but Dean wasn't backing down. "No," Dean replied firmly, his voice unwavering. "We're going to discuss it now." The manager was visibly tense, his hands trembling as he moved forward, trying to maintain control of the situation. But Dean wasn't having it. "I don't perform in places that treat people this way," he declared. The room was silent. Everyone was watching. The guards stood frozen. The audience was unsure of what was going to happen next, but it was clear that this wasn't just about a performance anymore. After a tense moment, the manager reluctantly stepped forward and conceded. "Mr. Hayes can stay," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "We apologize for the misunderstanding." Dean didn't miss a beat. "Thank you," he said with quiet dignity. Then, with a small smile, he turned back to the audience. "Now, where were we?" The applause started slowly, then grew louder. It wasn't just a polite response to the music. It was a standing ovation for what had just occurred. The audience wasn't clapping for the performance they had just witnessed. They were clapping for Dean's courage, for his defiance, for the quiet act of standing up for what was right. The following morning, word spread like wildfire across the Strip. What had happened at the Sands that night became the talk of the town. Performers, dealers, managers, everyone in the Las Vegas entertainment scene was buzzing about the incident. Some were inspired. They saw what Dean had done as a moment of true courage, a stand against the system that had been in place for so long. Others, especially the casino owners, were furious. How dare Dean defy the unspoken rules of the Strip? But there was no denying the impact of that single act. Dean had made a choice that day, one that would reverberate through the entertainment industry and beyond. It wasn't a grand revolution. The changes were small, incremental, and often behind the scenes. The Sands Hotel, for example, quietly relaxed some of its backstage access policies. It wasn't enough to undo the segregation, but it was a start. Other hotels began to notice. Within 6 months, a few venues began allowing black patrons into areas that had previously been off-limits. It wasn't a sweeping change, but it was progress. A start. Willie Hayes, who had been pushed out of the Sands just the night before, went on to become a piano instructor on the west side of Las Vegas. He lived out his life with dignity, his memory of the past few years, and that fateful night, forever etched in his heart. Dean, who had given him a front-row seat for every show at the Sands, ensured that he would always have a place to belong. For Dean, that night marked a turning point in how he used his influence. He continued to perform in Las Vegas, but his approach had shifted. He no longer took the system for granted. Small acts of defiance, of standing up for dignity and respect, became his new way of living. He wasn't just a performer anymore. He was someone who knew how to use his fame to make a difference. Years later, when Dean was asked about the events of September 12, 1962, he shrugged it off. "I just stopped a show," he said, downplaying the importance of what had transpired. Anyone could have done it. But Sammy Davis Jr., who had been close to Dean, had a different perspective. Sammy, who had lived through his own struggles with racism, was quoted as saying, "Dean didn't just stop a show that night. He stopped pretending he didn't see what was happening." That takes more courage than people realize. The story of what happened in the Copa room didn't change everything overnight. The Civil Rights Act was still 2 years away, and true equality seemed like a distant dream. But that night, Dean Martin made a statement that would echo for years. It changed him. It changed the way people saw him. And for Willie Hayes, who had been treated like an invisible man, it changed everything. For Willie, sitting in the front row, watching his friend perform, it was a reminder that sometimes, even small acts of defiance can create ripples of change. It was a moment that would live on, not just in the history of Las Vegas, but in the hearts of those who saw the courage it took to stand up for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. And that, more than anything, was the real legacy of that night.